Good morning. My name's Alice Grundy, and I'm managing editor of Australia Institute Press. It's my great pleasure to be welcoming you to Australia's biggest book club today with Richard Dennis. We're coming to you today from unceded Ngunnawal and Ngambri country, and I would like to pay my respects to the people who've cared for this country for many, many millennia and continue to do so. You can register for other webinars for the Australia Institute on our website, australiainstitute.org.au/webinars. A few notes about our Zoom webinar. You can type questions for Richard in the Q&A box, and you can upvote other people's questions too. Remember to keep things civil and on topic in the chat, otherwise we'll kick you out. And finally, this is a live event and it's being recorded. You'll be able to access the recording after we've finished on our website, australiainstitute.org.au. So, welcome to Richard Dennis, who's Executive Director of the Australia Institute. He's the author of several books, including Econobabble, Dead Right, and Big. And he spent his life moving between politics and academia. He's been Associate Professor at the ANU's Crawford School. And relevant for this book is his time as a staffer up in Parliament. So, Dead Centre, How Political Pragmatism is Killing Us, is the second essay in our Vantage Point series. And it tackles the stubborn idea that evidence-based policy and the sensible centre are somehow one and the same thing. From AUKUS to climate policy, Richard unpicks the kinds of decision-making that goes into contemporary Australian politics and talks about where we can go from here. So welcome, Richard.
Thanks, Alice. Thanks for having me on.
So you're accustomed to writing in all sorts of formats, whether it's a briefing, a report, a book, an academic article. Can you talk about what sorts of benefits there are in the essay format?
Oh, I love writing essays. I think writing essays for me is the hardest and funnest way to write. I guess my starting point for all of my communication, written, oral, I don't do a lot of dance, but, give it time. But I just always think shorter is better. I think the least amount of words required to convey the point is the number of words you should use. So, I literally think in terms of, is that a tweet? Is that an op-ed? Is that a briefing note? Is that an article? Is that an academic article? Is that a book or is that an essay? And trying to find the right sized idea for the right format, I think is key to communication. And the old saying, to a man with a hammer, the whole world is a nail. Well, I think if I've got a short point to make, well, I'll skeet it out on blue sky. If I've got a small point that needs some explanation, I'll write an op-ed. But for me, an essay is a really wonderful opportunity to kind of tell a story about a couple of related concepts that interact with each other, and where you need to bring together all sorts of different kinds of argument and all sorts of different kinds of evidence. And you've got the space to do that, but you don't have to stretch it out over a whole book. And, if you think about books with chapters, people read chapter 1 and then they read chapter 2 and then they read chapter 3. And if you structure the book well, they want to read the next chapter. But an essay, you kind of drag people from the beginning to the end. And hopefully people can read an essay like this in one or two settings because, all of the pages hopefully interact with each other. You don't get that, well, there's an op-ed, that was interesting and move on, or I'm only halfway through this book. I find it really challenging, but I also find it really fun because, you can tell anecdotes, you can use metaphor, you can bring in random bits of history that would never fit into an op-ed length piece, but make sense and I think flesh out, a longer piece like an essay.
And I think that's been part of the response to the book so far is people have really enjoyed the anecdotes. Can you tell us about the impetus behind this essay and why you wanted to write about centrism in Australia?
Oh, yeah. Look, I mean, as a researcher, I guess I'm intrigued by the idea that evidence can influence policy sometimes. And as someone who's interested in getting policy change, I'm not so much intrigued, I'm kind of bemused by why so many people think evidence is the only way to get policy changed in Australia. So to be clear, I think evidence can make a difference, sometimes. But the idea that if you've got evidence, you'll change policy is bizarre. And indeed, there is no evidence to support the idea that the person with the most evidence wins the policy debate. There's no evidence to support the idea that most policy in Australia is evidence based. But, and I say this with love, but also some contempt, our universities have just polluted the minds of generations by saying in Australia, evidence is based on policy. Here's how the policy cycle works. And tens of thousands of smart people have left uni believing that that works. And, economics has got some pretty weird models we teach our first year students, and everyone knows if our assumptions are wrong, our conclusions are wrong. Well, we haven't really evaluated evidence based policy in the same way. If you assume that all the department cares about is evidence, if you assume that, then evidence would change their mind. If you assume that all the parliamentarians care about is evidence, then evidence would change their mind. But where's the evidence that that's how the department acts? Where's the evidence that's how the minister acts? So it's sort of bugged me for years that so many people seem to think there's a binary that policy is either evidence based or it's populist nonsense. And I've written academic stuff about this before, but this is the first time I've tried to say to a broad audience, hey, let's dig into this. Because if people believe that there's something called the sensible centre, and if people believe that policy is all based on evidence in the sensible centre, then it's hard for them to believe that some things that are taken for granted in Australia are just errant nonsense.
I was at the Art of Tax Reform Summit in Sydney yesterday, and several times throughout the day, people said, oh, we need to model this. We need evidence for this. We need to prove that this is a good idea. And I kept talking with people in between sessions who said, we have the modeling, we have the evidence.
Yeah. And look, to be clear, evidence is good to have. And, here we are sitting in the Australia Institute today. We are a research organisation that generates evidence and puts evidence into public debate all the time. That's good. I think evidence can make a difference, but can doesn't mean will. So, yeah, for those people who think, oh, the reason you're failing to persuade a minister is you don't have the modelling, that's nonsense. And, the clearest proof of this is that Scott Morrison cooked up the most expensive procurement decision in Australian history, the AUKUS submarines, not only with no modelling, without even talking to Treasury. So, the idea that, big policy is always based on modelling and evidence, it's not true. When we floated the dollar, the Australian dollar, back in the early 80s, there was no modelling. So we make big decisions all the time, absent modelling, absent costing. And also we do modelling all the time that gets ignored. Why are we still subsidising native forest logging? Why are we still subsidising fossil fuel expansion? There's no economics that justifies something like subsidising a thing that causes harm. Economics 101, tax things you want to discourage, subsidise things you want to encourage. But power says, give me money or I'll yell at you. Guess what? Power trumps evidence often. Not always, but often.
So, given this reality, why do you think it's such a sticky concept in Australian politics?
Oh, that's a good question. I think that different people believe it for different reasons. The first reason to believe it is it's a kind of nice story to tell yourself. Who wouldn't want to believe that they live in a country that might not be perfect, but broadly speaking, our parliament comes together to make laws that kind of reflect the national interest. And, I prefer team A to team B, but even when team B's in, they're still spending my money kind of within rules and parameters based on evidence. So that's a nice story to tell yourself. I think academics play into the story more than they realize because they just want it to be true. Like if your thing in life is generating evidence, publishing it in journals that almost no one reads, and hoping it has impact, surely you'd want to tell yourself that there's public servants scouring academic articles for new evidence from which they can make change. So I think the public kind of want to believe it. I think a lot of academics want to believe it. But here's the cynical part: the people who are benefiting from terrible policy, the people who are benefiting from the status quo, would much rather the public and the media and the academics believe that there's evidence-based policy than to lift the curtain and confront everybody with the graphic horror. That the reason we still subsidize fossil fuels, the reason we still subsidize native forest logging, the reason we don't have free childcare has got something to do with evidence. So if you've got power, you could either admit that, show everybody that, and then watch people organize to take your power off you. Or, if people with power are smart, what they do is say, oh, I don't have any power. It's just that you might not understand why, but this policy is actually very good for everybody, and you don't have any modeling that proves otherwise.
Mm.
And then when you show up with modeling that proves otherwise, like it's easy to prove that, universal childcare would be better for the economy than tax cuts for rich blokes. We've done that modeling. But when you show up with that modeling, all of a sudden, no, we didn't really want to talk about modeling. We wanted to talk about political pragmatism, or we wanted to talk, So yeah, the hard truth is a lot of people like the fairy tale for different reasons. They like it. And the people that actually have the power to get what they want with or without modeling would rather conceal that power than reveal it.
Hmm. So, talking about concealing and revealing, what kind of role does the media play in this dynamic? And I'm thinking about the press gallery in particular.
Yeah, look, of course, the media has an important role to play in how people who consume that media, and that's a declining number, see the world that they live in. So, take for example, we recently had a productivity roundtable in Parliament House, and the media were all very breathless about what will be discussed and what won't be discussed and what will be proposed and what won't be proposed. But and there's no doubt the media played a role in letting people know who was in the room and what was being said. Um, but I think the media come to stories like that within the very narrow frame that was set up by the Treasurer and the Prime Minister. There wasn't much analysis of how come all the following groups weren't there. How come there were so many groups representing some kinds of power and no groups representing the kind of big changes that we might like to see in Australia? Literally, I cannot think of a simpler way to boost GDP per person in Australia than to make childcare universal and free. Okay, and it's hard to believe there would be many academic economists or economists that weren't getting paid to think otherwise that would dispute that helping young parents re-enter the labour force soon after they've had a kid, if they want to, that helping those people re-enter the workforce quickly does far more to boost GDP than giving rich blokes a tax cut. Like, it's almost unarguable. But that didn't get a mention at our productivity roundtable. All right. So, yeah, unfortunately, the media often just spit out what they were fed. And a consequence of that is if the government and the opposition do a good job of controlling the Overton window, of controlling what we're allowed to debate, it's very rare that the Australian media says, hey, readers, or hey, viewers, the government doesn't want to talk about this, the opposition doesn't want to talk about this. But, subsidizing fossil fuels when you're tackling climate change is about as dumb as it gets.
Mm.
So, yeah, unfortunately, the media really let powerful people set the parameters of the debate, and therefore people that consume that media really only get to hear about things that fit within the parameters that people with power are comfortable with.
And I think a good example of that was the first bill on housing that this government has passed was to build houses for people working on AUKUS. And not Australian people working on AUKUS, but US and UK people working on AUKUS. And when I talked about this to family and friends, they would say, I haven't heard about that. Why haven't I heard about that? That seems like a really big deal.
Yeah, exactly. And that's, that's the one of the key points I'm trying to make in the essay is that when we think of this sensible centre, so much of so much politics is wrapped up in bipartisanship. So let me put it slightly differently. If the Labor Party are here on something and the coalition are here on something, the sensible centre is, for a lot of people, defined by those two outliers. And you've got minor parties that are extreme over here, and you've got minor parties that are extreme over here, but the sensible centre is sort of located between the two major parties, according to the major parties and according to a lot of people in the media. Now, the consequence of that is when you get what for many is the holy grail of bipartisan consensus, then there's no room, right? There's only the sensible centre, and everything else is extreme. Everything else can't really be talked about by right thinking, sensible people. So when you've got both major parties committing to $360 billion worth of nuclear subs that we didn't used to know we need, when there's bipartisan support on those subs, then it's very hard to kind of have a debate about them. And then, of course, if there's bipartisan support for the subs and there's bipartisan support for prioritising the housing of UK and American military people, why would there be any media debate about that if there's no parliamentary debate about that? So, yeah, again, this idea that the centre is between the two parties, and when both major parties support logging native forests, when both major parties support, subsidising fossil fuels, when neither major party is at all interested in making childcare free for everybody, when there's bipartisan commitment to what I would think is a pretty dumb idea, the media kind of can't cope. So in turn, millions of people aren't wondering how come we can afford to build houses for those people, but we can't afford to build houses for Australians. Because why would the media report that? If neither major party think it's controversial, why would the media think it's controversial?
Hmm. And talking about, two sides of a debate and the middle, I think a really good example of that is the 2035 range or target.
Yeah.
So what kind of process goes into that decision making, and then what effect does it have on Australia's response to climate change?
Yeah, look, all the people that love evidence-based policy are going to hate what I'm about to say. But, what Labor are doing when they're talking about emission reduction targets has got nothing to do with science. It's got nothing to do with good economics. It's all to do with optics and symbolism and, of course, politics. So, particularly with climate, Labor are very good at this. I call it the game of persists.
Mhm.
So, what Labor want to do, what they want to do, and you just have to, whether you believe me or not, you have to stick with me for this argument. What Labor want to do is get criticised for their target. Getting criticised is the plan. Without the criticism, the plan doesn't work. So Labor wants to come up with a target for emission reductions, or a target for renewable energy production, or a target for electric vehicles, or a target, future, gonna get somewhere in the future. And they're banking on getting criticised by the Greens for not going far enough and by the Coalition for going too far. The criticism is the plan. The criticism is the point. And of course, no one's talking, or almost no one's talking about the fact that we've been setting targets and failing to meet them for decades, right? But that Labor doesn't really want to debate what they're doing in the 3 years that they're constitutionally here to govern for. They want to set long-term plans and targets, and they want to get criticised for them because, and this is overt strategy, Chris Bowen literally can say the Greens want to go further. They would, they're extreme. The Libs don't want to go anywhere. They would, they're extreme. Look at me owning the sensible centre. Right. So the fact that the target isn't based on the science of 1.5 degrees, isn't based on the economics of what's achievable, that's irrelevant. All that matters is the criticism. And the media play along, the environment groups play along, the coalition play along, and Labor sit back going, can you believe it? The roads are filling up with big utes. We're opening new gas and coal projects. Industrial emissions aren't falling under our safeguard mechanism, but we're the sensible centre. So yeah, sorry, evidence-based policy fans out there. And yeah, it's not an accident. Smart people are winning, and if you want to conceal the fact you're not really doing anything in the present, just promise to do something in the future, but make sure your promise about what you'll do in the future causes a fight, because the fight about the future is the cover story for doing bugger all today.
Hmm. And to take a different example from the book, you talk about the National Anti-Corruption Commission and how that came to be.
Hmm.
Can you tell us that story?
Yeah. So look, I'm someone who cares deeply about democracy. I'm someone who watches Parliament quite closely. So I see things not because they're really hard to spot, but because I look. And most people probably don't think about what I'm about to say, but it's obvious once you see this trick. When you're in government, according to our constitution, if you want to change the law, you have to get a new law agreed by a majority in the lower house and the upper house. And it's not like fine print, it's the constitution. The Senate exists, right? And if you want to get a law changed, you know, if you work in parliament, that you will not get the law changed unless you get a majority in the lower house and in the upper house. But in Australia, it's very unusual for a government to have a majority in both houses. So when we talk about majority government, we're talking about majority in the lower house. Now, people in the media get very excited about that, and they think that having a minority in the lower house is a big deal. I don't think it's a big deal. New South Wales is in minority government now. We're coming from the ACT, we're in minority government now. No big deal. But the media think minority government in the lower house is a big deal. But this causes a lot of confusion because we say, oh, Labor's got a strong majority, big majority. Yeah, in the lower house. Doesn't matter whether a bill passes the lower house by 1 vote or by 20, it's still got to get through the Senate. So that's all a long lead up to what I'm about to say. So when you're the Prime Minister and you want to change a law, if you've got a majority of the votes in the lower house in Australia, you bank on the fact it will pass through the House. You know that your side won't cross the floor. So Albo knows there's enough members of the Labor Party in the lower house that any bill he passes in the lower house will pass. But he also knows that he doesn't have the numbers in the Senate. So there's three options for a Prime Minister in this situation. He can look at a bill and think, all right, I'm going to need to negotiate with the Greens. When this gets to the Senate, I'm going to need to negotiate with the Greens because Labor plus the Greens will be enough votes to get it through the Senate. Or I can negotiate with the coalition because Labor plus the coalition will be enough votes to get it through the Senate. Or, and this is the really cynical one that people don't get, what if I don't really want to pass a new law? What if I just want to look like I'm passing a new law, trying to pass a new law, but thwarted by those nasty people in the Senate? Well, then I just put parts of the legislation, I put provisions in the legislation that I know the Greens will never support. I know the Liberals will never support. And they go, oh, I can't get it through the Senate. Now, a Prime Minister might do that so that he can tell his constituency, look, I'm trying to help, while promising a powerful group, don't worry, I'm not going to do anything. This will never get through the Senate. This is just performance art. So there's three ways for this government to get a bill through the Senate. It can work with the Greens, can work with the coalition, or it can fail to work with anyone and just blame people for, blame the Senate for doing nothing. Now I can answer your question about the NAC. In its first term, the Albanese government was committed to introducing a federal corruption commission. That's good. The Australia Institute have been calling for one for a decade. All the states had got one by that stage. So here's the Labor Party elected in 2022. Let's have a federal corruption commission. Okay, great, let's. But how are you going to get it through the Senate? With the Greens or with the coalition or not at all? And Labor just made a real virtue out of saying we have to work with the coalition. We have to. It's the only way to do bipartisan reform that will stick and last. We have to. And that nasty coalition insists that we can't have public hearings. Drats. I guess I'll have to take these provisions out. So it's, you just got to watch the trick. Is it the coalition's fault that we don't have public hearings for our federal corruption watchdog, or is it the Prime Minister's fault? Well, I'd blame the Prime Minister because he had the choice to get it through with the public hearings or get it through without the public hearings. And when he came to that T intersection, that's the route he took.
But if you have more votes when it passes through the Senate, it's more likely to be long lasting, right? That's how legislation works.
Yeah. So exactly. This sort of narrative is being built up by Labor, not by the coalition, by Labor, that if you want to do lasting reform, you have to have bipartisan support. Now, there's no evidence to support this. When John Howard was Prime Minister, he privatised Telstra by bribing Mal Colston to quit the Labor Party and become an independent. It passed by one vote. Is that lasting reform? Yep, it's still privatised. I could go all day. If you're a Prime Minister that wants to get shit done, and that's a big if, then whether you can get it through with one vote or with 20 votes, you get it through. That's what Julia Gillard did very successfully. We don't talk about the Gillard government, but it achieved a lot. But because it achieved a lot from minority status, we can't talk about it, right? We've vanished it from modern history. And similarly, in its first term, when Labor wanted IR laws through, they didn't say, oh, well, obviously we can't change industrial relations laws unless the coalition agree because we want lasting reform. No, they were very happy to work with the Greens on IR reform because they actually wanted to get it through and they knew the Libs would never do it. So, yeah, unfortunately, and again, it's only Labor that says this stuff. Labor are effectively giving the Liberal Party a veto over reform when Labor say we need to have bipartisan support for this bill for there to be lasting reform. Well, there's no such thing as lasting reform in a democracy. Any future parliament can change any laws subject to the Constitution. What you need to do when you're in parliament is get the things done that are important to you. And if they work, they'll stick. and maybe a future coalition government will rip them up. Maybe a future Labor government will rip them up. But yeah, this idea that Labor are now saying to have lasting reform, we need bipartisan support, is literally a Labor government with a massive majority in the lower house giving a moribund coalition veto over what Labor will do. Now, that's up to the Prime Minister, but that's not the Liberals' fault or the coalition's fault when Labor doesn't get much done.
And one last question before I open up to questions from the audience, but we've seen some changes in the Australian political landscape over the past couple of elections, and it's become true that there's no such thing as a safe seat anymore. What kind of effect do you think that has on the landscape as a whole?
Oh, look, it's great. I mean, and to be clear, I like democracy. I like people voting, and whether they vote for a so-called major party, a so-called minor party, or an independent, whatevs. Like, I like democracy. But democracy works when there's choices. And when both major parties agree that we should keep logging native forests, subsidise fossil fuels, approve new coal mines, can't give free childcare away, and won't introduce new taxes on big companies or billionaires. When the two major parties have promised to not fix a bunch of problems, well, it's pretty hard to do evidence-based policy. Pretty hard to do democratic reform if the two kind of so-called parties of government are determined to not tackle some problems. So I don't think it's a coincidence that at a point in history where the major parties have come to an agreement to not tackle gambling, to not tackle climate change, to not tackle inequality, to not really tackle the root causes of expensive housing, when the two major parties have kind of promised to not tackle big problems, who's surprised that voters are looking elsewhere? So what we're seeing at the moment, what we saw in 2019 was Tony Abbott lose what was thought to be one of the Liberals' safest seats to Zali Steggall. Did the Liberals take the hint in 2019? No, they didn't. In 2022, what happened? The Liberals lost 5 more safe seats. Now the Liberals can't actually, I don't think, get back into government until they can find a way to win back inner city votes. Now, what's happened with Labor over the same period, Labor have lost a few seats to the Greens. They won some back at the last election. But in 2025, in that so-called what was a landslide election, I'll tweak the metaphor in a minute, the landslide election where Labor won a near record number of seats, some of their safest seats nearly fell. So Fremantle, held by Josh Wilson, was one of Labor's safest seats, and he crept home with less than 1% of the vote. I think if Labor had approved the Northwest Shelf before the election, Labor would have lost that safe seat. Here in the ACT, the safest Labor seats in the country, Labor nearly lost the seat of Bean. I think it's 0.4% margin, what was once the safe seat. Again, if Labor had approved Northwest Shelf, I think they would have lost Bean here in Canberra. And while Adam Bandt obviously lost the seat of Melbourne, again, very close, but a win to Labor, and a win's a win. But again, if Labor had approved Northwest Shelf, does anyone think Adam Bandt would have lost Melbourne? So the way to understand this sort of landslide of Labor's is the landslide was very wide, but very thin. Like if it was mud slipping down a hill, yes, it covered a lot of the hill, but the mud's pretty thin. So just like the Liberal Party seemed to have lost and possibly given up on a whole bunch of seats, I think a whole bunch of so-called inner city seats, but seats with a lot of young voters, a lot of well-educated voters, a lot of high-income voters. I think Labor is at risk, despite their very large margin, of losing some of their safer seats if they continue to ignore the things their voters care about. Now, it's a democracy. There's a simple solution for Labor. Don't be like the Liberals. Look at the seats you nearly lost, pivot away from it. But when the Libs lost Warringah, did they pivot away or double down? They doubled down. What happened? It got worse.
Hmm. Well, we've got lots of questions to choose from, so we'll turn to those now. The first one is from Kate Crawford, who asks, how can we get government to understand the dynamic interaction between regulation, environment, social beliefs, and economic experiences?
Oh, look, great question. And sorry to reject the premise. The way to make government do anything is to make them fear the consequences of failing to do it. Right. So the Commonwealth government employs hundreds of thousands of people. Parliament House is full of thousands of staffers. So if we actually want to tell ourselves the reason the government's doing something bad is it doesn't know, we're kind of missing something really important. Like, we're the 13th largest economy in the world. We're a powerful nation state. Our governments have access to enormous amounts of advice and information. So when they choose to do things like robo-debt, right, we have to lean in and see that they chose to do it. When they choose to approve the Northwest Shelf, despite all of the environmental, cultural, and scientific reasons not to, we have to lean in and see what they did. So, the premise of your question is, how do we get government to make better joined up decisions that take broader perspectives into account? Well, we need to make sure that they fear the consequences of not doing that. So it's not like the government doesn't know how to redesign regulation. It's not like the government doesn't know how to do broader analysis of some things. It chooses not to. And at the moment, this government and the previous government were happy with that. It's only when they start losing seats, it's only when they actually face consequences for what you might see as their bad approach to making decisions that their self-interest will kick in and they'll change things.
Gavin Miller notes that there have been some recent articles on Australian government and democracy, including from William Parlett, Why the Rise of Cartel Parties in Australia Threatens Our Democracy, and Laura Tingle, Political Amnesia, How We Forgot How to Govern. He asks, is there an opening for an article to synthesize all these thoughts? And he's keen for a conference about it in Brisbane.
Hey, Gavin, proud supporter of the Institute's work. I know you follow what we do closely, so thank you. Look, I'm still talking about the last thing I wrote, so I won't commit to writing a new thing. But yeah, you're spot on. I think Laura Tingle has really kind of touched on this from a different perspective. I haven't read that work that you described, but I'll go and look into it, the cartel, because that's exactly kind of what's happened. And to be clear, I'm not accusing people of corruption. I'm not saying it's brown paper bags. I think a lot of progressives are probably too caught up on thinking it's all about donations and things. I think it's worse than that. It's just that our decision making process has created this kind of system where people with internal access and external power can get what they want done, and the people involved are happy to oblige, whether because they just avoided a fight with someone powerful or they're looking forward to working for that powerful person when they finish. But to be clear, our government knows how to act quickly. In the lead up to the last election, the environmental laws looked like they might accidentally help the environment. They might have accidentally helped the Maugean skate instead of the Tasmanian salmon farming industry. And our lawmakers fired up real quick and they got that law changed so that we could expand salmon farming and further jeopardize the Maugean skate. So let's be clear, our parliament knows how to act. Our parliament knows how to get things done, and it knows how to get things done quickly, comma, when it wants to. Why is it so eager to appease some groups and so determined to ignore others? Because their calculus is that that's fine, that ignoring some groups doesn't really hurt, and appeasing some groups is either good for your party next year or good for your job when you leave Parliament. So, again, that's why I think shaking things up with independents and minor parties is beneficial, not because everyone involved is perfect and right about everything, on the contrary, but because it's harder to have those confected, quiet backroom chats, and it's harder for to kind of keep the lid on certain problems when lots more people are involved in it. So yeah, might take a look at that, and if we did do an event, maybe Brisbane would be a great place to do it.
We have a couple of questions about what are the ways for the general population to have an opportunity to shift this kind of debate.
Oh, wow. Well, there's a webinar in itself. But the first thing is for everybody to believe what I've already said, that there is no such thing as a safe seat anymore. The idea that in Australia, and so I grew up, my whole kind of adult life, it was dominated by the following idea. There's 150 seats in Australia, but only 15 of them also are marginal. And if you live in a marginal seat, politicians will listen to you. If you live in a marginal seat, your interests will dominate the national interest. If you live in a marginal seat, we'll throw money at you and build you a bridge and build you a town hall. And the rest of us just sat back and kind of watched while the major parties fought over these so-called marginal seats. That's over. That's done. That's dusted. That's my point about Tony Abbott. That's my point about Josh Frydenberg losing his seat. That's my point about Josh Wilson nearly losing Fremantle and David Smith nearly losing Bean. There's no such thing as a safe seat. So every ordinary person watching is a voter, and you have power. It is in corporate power's interest to convince you that you don't have power. It's in the government's interest to convince you you don't have power, uh, but you do. And you just saw Nicolette Buller win the seat of Bradfield by 26 votes. I had friends overseas going, "Oh, I live in Bradfield. And I didn't bother casting my postal, my pre-poll." So yeah, the real kind of trick in our democracy from those with undemocratic power is to convince us that there's no point. It's to convince us that your individual efforts are pointless. That you just you're fighting a bushfire with a water pistol. But of course, that's not true for all sorts of reasons. Why do they work so hard to ban protests if protest is ineffective? Why did the government and the media spend so long trying to convince people that hundreds of thousands of people crossing the Sydney Harbour Bridge in support of the people of Palestine had no impact on the government at all, right? Because they don't want you to think you have power. So That doesn't mean every individual gets their way. That's not how democracy works. But wherever you live, you do not live in a safe seat. There's no such thing. You should be writing to your local MP. You should be asking for a meeting. You should be taking your friends. You should be doing everything you can to work with whatever organisations you're involved in, community organisations, unions, whatever, P&Cs, to say, hang on, if we all think this, why don't we all tell my local MP? Because I promise you, your MP knows, no matter what seat you're in, your MP knows that there's no such thing as a safe seat anymore. So the main thing you can do is own that, and organising and working with other people, being polite, being respectful, but being involved is a nightmare for every MP if you behave like that.
Hmm. Margaret Callanan asks, could you comment on the value or not of the mainstream media versus alternative media versus social media regarding news analysis and commentary?
Yeah, look, like Parliament, I'm into diversity. I really am. I think choice is good. I mean, I consume a lot of so-called legacy media, mainstream media. I consume a lot of it. I consume a lot of social media. I talk to a lot of people. I consume a lot of international media. That's my job, right? So everyone's not going to consume as much media as I do. Um, I think there are real advantages from the old-fashioned traditional media, including resources and long-run context, and because they've got a brand to protect, they're unlikely to do certain things. They're unlikely to knowingly lie to you. They're unlikely to, do certain things that might make you lose their trust in them instantly because they want to protect their brand. But at the same time, they get caught up in this idea of a sensible centre. Most of their stories are fed to them by the government or by the opposition. So they don't kind of want to attack the government or opposition too hard because that's where their stories come from. So yeah, diversity is good. I really fear the ABC has lost its way. I think people should be careful about saying save the ABC. I think we need to fix the ABC. So I think it's a challenging time, not just in Australia, around the world for the media. I don't want to see the old media collapse. I want to see it do a better job than it has. And at the same time, I think that social media and new media ventures have brought new voices and new perspectives into the market. That's good too. I mean, I'm old enough to remember when Kerry Packer owned Channel 9. I don't think there was a good old days in the Australian media. I don't hark back to any era where I think, oh, that was a great time to get new progressive ideas out there and get people talking about things. The olden days weren't that flash. The current system's got a whole lot of problems with it. We're not in control of it, but I think we can influence it and shape it. But yeah, big picture, diversity's good. But we're going to have to, as a society, grapple with things like the way AI can fake a face, fake a voice, really put lies in someone else's mouth. I think that stuff scares me more than, whether a blogger is or isn't a journalist. People will choose to listen to who they want to listen to, but we don't let people scream fire in a crowded theatre. And I don't think we should let people take other people's image and put words in their mouth that they never said. I think it's going to be very hard to do democracy when that's a possibility.
Hmm. We have a question from Patricia Farah, who asks, an elected government will often claim they have a mandate. Does this mean that they can do what they like?
Look, you can claim to be, tapped on the shoulder by God if you want. Again, I'm old fashioned. Just read the Constitution. That's what kind of governs how things work. And there's no mention of the Prime Minister in the Constitution. There's certainly no mention of mandate in the Constitution. What there is in the Constitution is a whole bunch of rules about how we elect people to Parliament and what the Parliament's empowered to do and not do. So, no, mandate's a made up concept, but you know, if a politician can use rhetorical devices like mandate to put pressure on their opponents and it works, okay, there's no law against doing that. But there's no law that says if you've got a big majority in the lower house, people should vote the way you tell them to vote in the upper house. It's just not a thing. So yeah, man, like the idea of a safe seat, the idea of a mandate is just this concept that has been thought up by powerful people to maintain their power and to extend their power.
Sandra Gates asks, in your view, where or what are the most effective points in our systems to shift the Overton window away from this mythical sensible centre? At all levels, deep myths, values, systems, data, headlines, litany.
Yeah, look, all of the above, and obviously here at the Australia Institute, the reason I'm talking about these things is I think they're important. I'm trying to help more people sort of see the problems and the opportunities in our democracy. What are the levels? What are the levers to pull? Well, again, by definition, here at the Australia Institute, we focus on what I would see as sort of big structural issues like how much tax do we collect? What are we doing about, fossil fuels? What's Australia's foreign policy? What should our rules for democracy be? Like by design, as a broad-based think tank, we are set up, or we've set ourselves up to focus on those sort of meta issues in some sense, because most people think we should spend more on health. Most people think we should spend more on education. Most people think we should spend more reducing income inequality. But most people don't go out and say, therefore, rich people have to pay more tax, or therefore, the gas industry have to pay more tax. So, our point of intervention is let's do the structural stuff, frankly, that most people don't do, right? Because they're focused on, well, I want to make unis better, or I want to make nursing homes better, or I want to make childcare better. That's good, but if the right just keeps succeeding in cutting taxes, and progressives are just out there asking for more spending, well, guess what? If they win the tax debate, you're going to lose the spending debate. So that's how we kind of come at these issues. But I don't think everybody should emulate our strategy. I don't think everybody should emulate our priorities. I think that, like the first question about what can I do? I'm just one person. I think everyone has to ask themselves, all right, if they're the things I want to influence, where's the best point of intervention for you, for me, given who you are, where you are, how much time you've got to put into it, what network you can bring. Like the answer's different for everybody, but that's why democracy is a participation event, and if everyone says, you'll never get a structural thing changed because there's no structural lever to pull, well, if everyone believes that, I don't think we'll get much changed. But whether it's you do it yourself, whether it's you support groups like ours, whether it's you go set up your own new thing, yeah, no right answer, but you got to figure out, given your resources in every sense of the term resources, where do I think I can make a difference, and put your resources to where you think that is.
John Smith asks, if all the government wanted was the criticism on the climate target, and you suggest the climate movement played into their hands by protesting, what would be a better strategy for the climate movement?
Well, the Australia Institute strategy, you'll almost never hear me talking about percents. Certainly percentage targets for some future, year based on 2005, really what we try to do is move away from the game of percents entirely and just hold the government accountable for the decisions they're making while they're in power with a lever to pull, right? So you can't well, I'll put it differently. The government finds it excruciating that while they're busy playing the game of percents, groups like the Australia Institute are saying, but you just opened a new gas project, mate. They're like, yeah, but look at the percents, right? So part of the trick is to see the trick. And part of the trick is to then say, well, because I'm not going to fall for that, I'm just going to keep reminding people, here's what we do. So, imagine if you said to your kids, you haven't tidied your room, you promised you were going to tidy your room. Why don't you tidy your room? And they say, well, you said you were going to take me to Japan next year and you haven't even booked the flights yet. It's like, who cares? How are these things related? Why get trapped into a future fight about a future thing when someone's failing to do what they said right in front of you now? So yeah, the step one, you have to see the trick, and then step two, you have to avoid the trick. And yeah, the last thing Labor wants to do is have a binary conversation about should in 2025 we still be opening new gas and coal projects or not, yes or no. They don't want to have a binary debate with a yes or no answer. How do we end whaling? By ending whaling. How do we end asbestos? By ending asbestos. How do we end fossil fuels? By setting a 2050 target and tapering down with a meaningful, but they don't want to answer the simple question, because if they answer the simple question and said, yeah, we just like new coal and gas, they know they'll lose a lot of votes. So they have to play this game of persists. And yeah, if you share that assessment, if you care about what the climate science says, which is where I take my lead from, you just have to not get dragged into what is a confected fight about an arbitrary target for an arbitrary year in the future.
Hmm. Uh, I'm sorry that we won't be able to get through everyone's questions today. We have time for just one more. This one from Jock Churchman. Do a lot of our problems originate from the parties being so tight and unyielding internally? There appear to be some very good people in the Labour backbench, but they are obviously sat upon or bought off by the leadership. Have we reached the end of two-party governments?
Look, great question, and time to plug the book. Yeah, look, I talk a lot about this in the essay. To be clear, Australia has quite a unique democratic system. We call it a Westminster system. Sometimes we call it a Washminster system, some combination of the US and the UK, but really it's not. So in the UK, they do not, I'm choosing my words carefully here, they do not have binding caucus votes every time the bells ring. People cross the floor all the time in the British Parliament. In the US, they don't even have a term for crossing the floor. They just call it voting. So Australia is unique in having what looks like a two-party system. It's breaking down a bit, but there's still strong elements of a two-party system. That's rare. That's not the norm in democracies. But while we're in that small group of countries that often just alternate between two parties, we're unique in the binding party discipline of those parties. Now, that's okay. It's up to parties to make up their own rules. But I think by strapping your party members so tightly to the caucus position, um, they're really finding it harder and harder to navigate complex issues. And people crossing the floor is a kind of pressure release valve. So in the UK, if the UK Prime Minister's doing something that, a lot of his party thinks a bit crap, well, a lot of them just cross the floor. And of course that creates debate. And of course that means that people sort of say, well, what's really going on here? But it doesn't mean the Prime Minister loses his job, but it does mean that at least UK Labor voters can see, oh, hang on, the person I voted for really does have the values that I think. But when Labor forced Penny Wong to oppose same-sex marriage for a decade, that didn't ring true for a lot of people. And clearly asking Fatima Payman to vote against her conscience on issues relating to Palestine was too much for her. So I don't blame parties for having rules. Labor's got a rule of a binding caucus vote. If they think that's a good idea, that's a them question. But the consequence of that is that a lot of Labor MPs have to literally say one thing in Parliament while they think an entirely different thing. Now, if they can live with that and that's a successful strategy, okay. But I think voters are increasingly wanting some sincerity, and that binding party discipline obviously gets in the way of that.
Hmm. Well, thank you so much, Richard, for an excellent conversation today.
Thanks, Alice, for an excellent conversation today.
And you can get your copy of Dead Centre either on the Australia Institute website or in your favourite local bookshop. And for those of you, I can see from the questions, lots of you have read it already. Just a reminder that we've got a little note like in the old-fashioned library books where you can write your email and then hand it on to someone. It's a great way to start a conversation with friends and family and to keep it going. So thanks so much, Richard. Thank you all for coming and for those excellent questions. Don't forget that you can subscribe to the Australia Institute on YouTube and you can catch up with our podcasts, Follow the Money, Dollars and Cents, and After America. And we'll see you for Australia's biggest book club next month. Thank you.
Thanks for watching. If you'd like to keep up to date with all our latest research and work, sign up to our newsletter. Delivered every fortnight, it includes behind-the-scenes updates from Richard Dennis, an exclusive cartoon from Judy Horacek, details for our upcoming events and webinars, as well as explainers, graphs, and not to mention the latest cutting-edge research and analysis from the team here on the key issues that are facing Australia. Click the button on your screen to check it out.